Well, a friend of mine has a 5-year-old son named Charlie. One spring afternoon, while they were working in the yard, Charlie stumbled upon a little caterpillar that was climbing up the trunk of a nearby tree. So Charlie became fascinated observing this little worm. As he watched, Charlie began telling his father all that he'd been learning about caterpillars in the last several weeks. You see, this was just after Easter, and in his Sunday school class, they'd been learning about caterpillars as part of their lessons. They talked about the miraculous change that a caterpillar would go through as it seems to die in its cocoon, then transform into a marvelous butterfly. As Charlie told his father all about the changes this caterpillar was going to make, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked something peculiar. "Daddy, do caterpillars know that they become butterflies?" His father thought about it for a moment and of course realized nobody really knows. So finally he replied, "Well, I'm not certain, but I don't think they do." Charlie was silent again for a few moments, and then after thinking about it, suddenly with a great smile on his face, turned to his father and said, "Daddy, let's tell this one." I suppose in part that's my privilege this morning, to tell you the amazing news of this day. That the stone has been rolled away, that the tomb is empty, that Christ is risen, and as a result, nothing, including you and I, will ever be the same. And while I'm certain you've heard this news before, I can't help but wonder if you know it to be true. After all, there is a difference. It's one thing to be aware of an old story that's told. It's another for that story to become true for your own life. Especially a story that, quite frankly, seems too good to be true. Many of us experienced such a story last Sunday as we watched a 43-year-old Tiger Woods slip on his 5th green jacket at the Masters. An old story one generation had only heard, including his children, but now were experiencing for themselves. Although apparently the world felt the same some 33 years earlier when, at the age of 46, Jack Nicklaus won his 6th. One news reporter I read this week who covered both those stories recalled being in the media room after Jack had been interviewed following his win in 1986. The reporter was standing next to another reporter who was sitting, staring blankly at the page in front of him, seemingly trying to figure out what he was going to write about all this. This reporter whom I was reading could hear his colleague whispering to himself, but couldn't quite make it out. And so he leaned in a bit and finally heard the words this reporter was muttering to himself. "It's just too big. It's just too big." Obviously, making a comeback in a career is not the same as literally coming back from the dead. But there are those stories that just seem so fundamentally impossible to believe. So much so that even if they're true, we wouldn't even recognize them if they unfolded before our very eyes. Especially in our world today. We have a hard time trusting any of the news we receive, regardless of how believable it might be. I recall not long ago being at the gym, running on the treadmill, while watching 2 different television monitors project the news from 2 different media outlets. Both were reporting on the same set of events, and yet the headline on each screen told 2 completely different stories. I thought to myself, it's no wonder we fact-check one another in mid-conversation and make routine visits to Snopes.com. In fact, my guess is if Luke had been writing today, he might have said, "But these words seem to them like fake news." And they did not believe them. But instead, in order to describe this tale the women tell at the first Easter, Luke uses the Greek word leiros, which most biblical scholars have translated as idol, except that idol doesn't quite capture how they really felt about this news. Anna Carter Florence says, Leiros is more like the stuff organic farmers use to fertilize their fields. It's a locker room word. Or to put it in terms I can get away with in a sermon, especially on Easter Sunday, let's just say the disciples thought the news the women brought back from the tomb is pure and total nonsense. And understandably so. It'd be like someone today saying, hey, the leaders of every nation just got together and had a big meeting and we've all established world peace. Or guess what? New statistics were just released and world hunger no longer exists. Or you're not going to believe this, but every person on the planet now has access to adequate health care. That is just Leiros. But not for everyone. Or at least not Luke. No, Luke sees things differently, even from his colleagues Matthew, Mark, and John. Or at least that seems to be the case given his word selection. In fact, I'd never noticed it before. It's subtle, but it's significant. I wonder if you caught it. Luke writes, he's not here, but is risen. If you go back and look at the other three Gospels, no one else uses that conjunction in the Easter message. They say things like, he's been raised, he's not here, or he's not here, for he's risen, but not Luke. In fact, Luke begins this passage with that word and then goes on to use it 6 different times in just 12 short verses as opposed to Matthew, Mark, and John, who only use it sparingly. Which got me wondering, what is Luke up to with this stubborn, defiant, relentless conjunction? Why does Luke employ this word more than any other in his telling of the Easter story? Well, I can only tell you I have a friend a lot like Luke, or at least he uses that word a lot too. In fact, it gets a little annoying sometimes. He's quite the contrarian. In addition to the frequency with which he uses but, he's also constantly saying things like, well, there's another side to that story, and on the other hand, and there is the other side of the coin. He's always offering that competing narrative, a different perspective, an alternative point of view. In fact, he seems to see the world through a different lens and is constantly pointing it out. And I don't think he and Luke are alone. Which I was reminded of a few weeks ago when I first met Stephanie. By the time I got to her, her husband of 1 week was on life support at Grady Memorial downtown. Earlier that day, I'd received a message from a colleague who explained to me her circumstances. Stephanie and her husband, Matt, were driving through Atlanta on their way back from their honeymoon when he suddenly went unconscious. She immediately rushed him to the emergency room where it was determined that a brain aneurysm had burst. He was pronounced brain dead almost immediately, with no probability for recovery. Matt and Stephanie had been married by my colleague only a week earlier in Kentucky. And now Stephanie was making life and death decisions for her husband. When I came into the room, there was a heaviness present. The family had arrived and they were paralyzed by this news, immobile. But not Stephanie. She was moving about, obviously in shock, but nevertheless a little lighter than everyone else in the room. Her husband was gone, but just a few minutes before I arrived, the doctors had given her some different news. She said to me, "It's awful. I can't believe he's gone. But he's an organ donor. He will die today, but 5 other people will live. He's not here, but is risen." And whether you realize it or not, you've experienced it too. Like when that depression had so consumed you, you couldn't even get out of bed. But then your friends literally picked you up and got you to where you needed to go. Or when you woke up in the hospital flat on your back, writhing in pain, but then that physical therapist lifted you up, walked with you every step of the way in the road to recovery. Or when your marriage was seemingly over, all that was left was to file the paperwork. But then, that counselor, a renewed commitment from you and your spouse, and a lot of hard work not only saved it, but made it better than it had ever been before. He's not here, but is risen. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting it's always so easy to see. In fact, sometimes we don't want to see. Or at least that's how I feel about Planet Nine. Have you all heard about this? The scientific community introduced us to it a couple of years ago. Apparently it's 10 times the mass of Earth and 50 billion miles away. Scientists from the California Institute of Technology explained that while they've not actually found the planet, they're sure it exists because nothing else can account for the way objects in the outer part of the solar system move. It sounds like Leiros to me. After all, I'm still getting used to the fact that Pluto's no longer a planet, let alone trying to include another heavenly body into my cosmology. Not to mention, I'd have to change the mnemonic device I used in second grade to learn the names of the planets. My very educated mother just served us 9 pies, right? It's just too much. Too big. Which I suppose is the reason John points out that the first Easter begins early in the morning in the dark. Because Easter can be hard to see. Like when that call comes that the church is burning to the ground. Or when the heart monitor flatlines. Or your significant other says, I don't love you anymore. Or your boss says, we've got to let you go. Or your addiction tells you, I need more. Or the doctor says, it's terminal. The Easter story feels like the furthest thing from the truth. I get it. I've been there. New life can seem like Leiros. But then the church gets rebuilt, and broken hearts mend, and life carries on after tragedy in ways that are more faithful and satisfying and joyful than they were ever before. And we're reminded that Easter isn't just an old story about which we've heard. It's a very present reality in all that is, so built into the very essence of all creation, so interwoven into the very DNA of all that exists, that over and over again, what is old becomes new, what is impossible becomes possible, that even out of death comes new life. So even if grief has you so overwhelmed you feel incapacitated, or even if you feel entrapped by the discouragement in your life, or even if you've made a mess of things, put yourself so deep in the grave that you don't think you'll ever be able to claw your way out, God has the power to raise you up and put you back on the path God intends you to be. At least that's my story. That's what I've come to know and experience and believe. I don't know the scientific answer to the question Charlie asked of his father. Do caterpillars know that they'll become butterflies? But I do know the theological one. No, if we don't tell them. So I hope yours is becoming clearer this morning. After all, the world needs to hear your Easter story too. It's not mine to tell, but I can get you started. He's not here. But